Before we go any further at all, just want to a couple of quick thank yous, especially the Institute of Social Responsibility at Edge Hill University, who are facilitating this webinar, the one last week and the one next week. And I'm incredibly grateful to them. And also especially grateful to Danny Harkness from the Institute and from Edge Hill University. And thirdly, I'd like to thank all of you for listening, welcoming me into your homes or your offices, wherever you happen to be. We're talking today about compensation that was paid under the Slavery Abolition Act 1833. And we're going to talk a little bit about plantations, talk about how the act came about, and then look at some Liverpool people who received compensation. The compensation, of course, wasn't to the enslaved people who had been worked to death in many cases, who had been abused over the years and had done so without any pay. They didn't receive any compensation. The compensation was for the people who owned the plantations, as crazy as that might seem. So here we are, a poem by William Cowper, poet and anti-slavery campaigner. I am shocked at the purchase of slaves, and I fear those who buy them and sell them on knaves. What I hear of their hardships, their tortures and groans, is almost enough to draw pity from stones. I pity them greatly, but I must be mum, for how could we do without sugar and rum? Especially sugar, so needful we see. What, give up our desserts, our coffee and tea? Written 1788, 50 years before the abolition of slavery. And sugar was an enormous aspect of it all. The plantations, the areas where goods were grown by enslaved people, was the Americas, for a generic term. As far as Britain was concerned, mainly the islands of what we now call the West Indies, the Caribbean islands, and also land, it's now called Guyana, and it was British Guyana, French Guyana, Dutch Guyana, the north coast of South America. We'll have a look at some maps in a little while. Sugar growing, sugar cultivation was desperate work. It was very, very difficult. Cutting the sugar cane was extremely hard. You needed machetes to cut it. It was then heavy. It then had to be crushed and boiled, and goodness knows what else. Here we've got a plantation. We've got ox carts bringing bundles of sugar cane to a mill where it's going to be crushed. You know, you can see that first cart has got 6 oxen towing it, give you an idea of the weight of the stuff, and the people in the foreground gathering it up to take into the mill. The cultivation of sugar or any other goods in the West Indies, in the Americas, was accompanied by dreadful cruelty, dreadful barbarity. You've got 4 images across there, 2 of people being beaten, 1 of an enslaved person being put into a vat of boiling sugar, and the one on the right is a picture of the treadmill in Jamaica, which was used for punishments, and you held on to the bar at the top. You can see people doing that and just walked around the treadmill, and that turned it round. There was no point to it. It was just punishment. The punishment, the barbarity, was a method of control of the enslaved people. The enslaved people vastly outnumbered the Europeans in the Caribbean, in South America. And part of the way that enslaved people were controlled was by threats, and threats carried out often, of physical violence. We'll just see a very tiny example of this connected with Liverpool in a little while. But there was that violence. There was also a control of the enslaved people by a couple of ways. It was common to give the enslaved people the surname. They took away their African names they would have, obviously, they had African names. They'd take them away and they would give them European names. It would be John, Sandra, Julie, whatever European names. But give us a surname, a family name, the name of the owner of the plantation, or the name of the overseer of the plantation. It's interesting enough, in virtually all the cases, in fact, in all the cases we're going to look at for Liverpool people, none of them, no, so yes, one or two did. Very few went to the Caribbean to see the plantations. They relied on letters from the managers, from the overseers, and, you know, they would get replies and they could control what was said that way. Perhaps some of the people in Liverpool didn't know what was going on. It's being generous, we can say that. The other way of control was to have the enslaved people baptized and to go to church on Sunday. And this has been put to me that it was a kindness to baptize them into the Church of England. But it wasn't, of course. It was a further method of control. It was to take away their own religions. When people moved from Africa, that implies they had a choice in it. When they were removed from Africa forcibly, they had their own religions. So you take those religions off them, you're controlling them more. You implant in them the 10 Commandments and the concept, if you obey the 10 Commandments, then you will have a better life when you die. You will go to heaven when you die. Their life was awful. So a promise of a better life was, again, a method of control. So a couple more quotations, one from 1776, from Adam Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Our tobacco colonies send us home no such wealthy planters as we see frequently arrive from our sugar island. There wasn't as much money in tobacco. And quotation here from Eric Williams. I'll give you details of Eric Williams' book at the end of the talk. It's only just been published in Britain. And it's from 1944. Eric Williams was the first Prime Minister of Trinidad, and he got his doctorate from Oxford way back, sort of before the Second World War. He said the sugar planter ranked among the biggest capitalists of the mercantilist epoch. And certainly my research tends to suggest that the people who were involved in plantation business, they were called in Liverpool West India merchants, and they seemed to be far more wealthy than people who were engaged in the slave trade. People who were engaged in the slave trade made what's euphemistically called a fast buck. People within the sugar business, the West India trade, and later cotton, seemed to have the wealth, the greater wealth, and keep it for a greater length of time. So here we have Jamaica, and you've got 45 miles as the thing there. So you're only talking about a relatively small island, and you're seeing all the plantations around the coast there. You've got on the details at the top, the legend at the top, you've got sugar works, cotton works, indigo works, important, and cocoa works. These were all things highly desirable in Britain, highly desirable in Europe. This is the other place that you may not be familiar with. This is the very north coast of South America, around the Demerara and the Essequibo rivers. And both of these were great sites for plantations, especially sugar plantations. And a lot of people who had plantations in Liverpool had them in Demerara. And we still talk about Demerara sugar. I found some in the cupboard this morning, so I took a photograph of just to prove it, but you can see it on your supermarket shelves any day of the week. So it wasn't only sugar, it was cotton increasingly. We'll see some imports from 1770 in a little while. Coffee, indigo, rum, timber of various sites, especially mahogany, and turpentine, all came from the West Indies, from plantations into Liverpool, and they were then shipped around Europe from Liverpool, and around Britain for that matter, a big coastal trade. So here's the common image that we see: the kindly European encouraging his sons to sign a petition to grant an enslaved person freedom. And this, of course, is freedom from a situation, mercantile business that they had started themselves. So it's hardly kind to give somebody freedom from something you've started yourself. But this is how it was portrayed. There were sugar strikes in various places in Europe, very successfully in Germany, not as successful in Britain, where people wouldn't buy sugar, but they were small and far separated, and it had very little effect on the business. This is where the real process of slavery abolition came from, in what are called slave revolts, revolts of enslaved people in various places in the Caribbean, various places in South America, and specifically this one, the Baptist War in Jamaica, 1831-32. Samuel Sharp was a Baptist deacon, a black Baptist deacon, and he raised the people in Jamaica to this revolt. Some 500 enslaved people died, 207 in the fighting, and around 300 were executed afterwards. I think between 17 and 20 Europeans, Jamaicans, or there were British soldiers there as well, were killed in the revolt. It was one of many. So when you hear that the Europeans graciously gave the enslaved people their freedom, the enslaved people fought for their freedom, and their fighting for the freedom was more important to granting freedom than any number of petitions or sugar strikes or things like this. And this is what the important thing is. Not important for the enslaved people, but important for the people making decisions. £1.154 million worth of damage was done in Jamaica, £124 million in present values. Always difficult to say, but 1.154 million. This is a time when a private soldier in a line regiment in the British Army was earning £18 a year. Give you the idea of the amount. And once this started, huge sums of damage. The British government, and it's still the case now, if you talk to people in the fire and rescue service and in the police service, the main role, they do save people's lives, obviously, and it's very important, but the main role is the preservation of property. And this is property that is being destroyed. And it was debated in Commons, and the government put forward the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, a direct result of the Baptist Rebellion. It wasn't comprehensive by any manner or means. So it was 28th of August, 1833, it was passed, didn't come into force until the 1st of August, 1834. And even then, it was in all lands controlled by the British Crown, except in Ceylon and St. Helena, Ceylon now, Sri Lanka, of course, St. Helena, and in lands controlled by the East India Company. So even then it wasn't comprehensive. And it was even less comprehensive because it wasn't immediate. There was immediate emancipation of children aged 6 and under. Yes, children aged 6 and under were considered enslaved people, and they were given their freedom. After the people older than 6, there was a period of 6 years apprenticeship. The apprenticeship was argued for and proposed because the people who were enslaved would not know how to look after themselves. They've been so well looked after, probably just leave that hanging in the air for a second or two. They've been so well looked after by the people who own the plantations that they would need time to adjust to being free. They'd have to learn how to grow crops. Hello, they grew crops. They'd have to learn how to build houses. They built the houses that they lived in. Even if there were slave barracks, they built them. And during this apprenticeship period, the enslaved people were still not paid. And unconditional emancipation came 1838. They didn't let the 6 years run its course. It was increasingly stupid and seen as such. Here we have again, this is a sugar boiling situation that you've got here. So let's have a quick look. William Enfield's History of Liverpool, 1773, largely referred to as the first history of Liverpool. And we've got some imports into the town here. If you're looking at pretty well all of those, the last item or the next to last item of it is sugar. And if you look at Jamaica, the middle column, but you look at the top of the right-hand column, there's sugar. 5,973 hogsheads, 973 terraces, and 153 barrels. They're all different types of barrels, this, of sugar in 1 year from Jamaica. And others, you've got staves, you've got gum, grain, cotton. Cotton starting out in Antigua there, 168 bags, a relatively small amount. This would grow and grow and grow. Look at exports from Liverpool. Not particularly interested in any of the others. It's mainly finished goods that go, but the bottom of the column for Jamaica, that's actually in the third column there, and the bottom column there, it says whips, 31 dozen and a half. If you want concrete proof of the barbarity of slavery, it is there in that one line. 31 dozen and a half whips taken to Jamaica alone. So here is how the emancipation of enslaved people was seen. And this is fairly basic as it is. And at the time, fat people were considered wealthy because they had enough money to buy food. And slim people were considered poor because they didn't have money to buy food. And a similar thing applied to people who were pale and people who were tanned. Wealthy people were pale because they worked indoors or they didn't work, and people who worked on the land were tanned. This is in Europe, obviously, because they worked outside. Special dispensation was given to military and naval officers whose job took them away, but they were considered okay. But here we have the enslaved people celebrating their freedom. And the person third from left, sorry, there with the hat on, bent over, is having his pocket robbed of £20 million. And this was the amount of compensation that was paid to people who had owned plantations. And the person having his pocket picked is John Bull, the British public. And the person on the extreme left is the plantation owner. You see, again, larger build because he was wealthy and could have lots to eat. And he's got his hand out there for the money. So onto Liverpool people. Over 100 Liverpool people received a total of £1,546,700 in compensation under the Act. The amounts were very carefully worked out. Different types of enslaved people got different types of commission, different types of compensation. Beg your pardon. And it was done to the penny. I'm going to show you the details of a website worked by University College London that allow you to find the details of individuals who received compensation. You'll see then it went down to pennies, obviously old pennies, obviously, for the compensation. If anybody would like to email me, I can send you a list of the people from Liverpool who received compensation. Save you looking it all up, but you can look it up and things like this. So it varies, the list, from George Gowling, who received £38, 16 shillings and 9pence in respect of one enslaved person in Barbados. It was sometimes considered an investment that you would buy an enslaved person. You would need to have some sort of connection over there to do this. And an investment and you would earn money from that person. And then George Gowling got £38 when this person was given their freedom. Then rates from that at one end. You could also, enslaved people were also available, rather than ownership, that you could hire enslaved people. If you had a situation much like now, where a certain crop requires involvement of people at a certain time of year, fruit picking in Britain is an example, or times when you are sowing or planting, you could hire enslaved people for a period of time and use them for a specific purpose. So maybe that's what George Gowling did. We don't know. There's no details about George Gowling to help us. It runs through to John, later Sir John Gladstone, first baronet, and he received in excess of £105,000 in respect of 2,912 people on 11 estates in Jamaica and British Guiana that he owned. He never went there to see. He made a fortune, as we'll see later. We're going to look at some of the people from Liverpool who were beneficiaries under this act. First chapter is a chap called John Bolton. John Bolton, 1756 to 1837. John Bolton was a considerable player in the slave trade. His ships went off and kidnapped Africans to the Americas to sell. He made that money. He was a plantation owner and a West Indian and South American merchant, Jamaica and Demerara and Essequibo. So 1780s and 90s, his annual profits were in the region of 40,000. There are more details than there are for slave traders, for owners of plantations and their income. So £40,000. Again, I'll just go back to the soldier earning £18 a year. John Bolton raised a regiment of 600 volunteers in Liverpool at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and he equipped and clothed them at his own expense and liked to be called Colonel Bolton, and he was known as Colonel Bolton after that. He received compensation of £35,000. Now, if you say, well, you're getting 40,000 a year profits, so from his point of view, that wasn't 1 year's profit. The fact that his enslaved people had been freed didn't mean that they stopped working for him. Conditions certainly improved for them, not dramatically, but they did improve for them. And they were paid a wage. I'm guessing a very modest wage. And so he could continue to get his profits from his sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Stores Hall in Windermere, which is still there. It's a hotel now, and that was his home in Windermere. He came from Kirby Lonsdale. He came from the Lake District, and he built a home for himself on the shores of Windermere. Rather fine properties, I think you'll agree. Far more common amongst owners and slaves were women owners. I'm sorry about the dogs barking. I don't know why they suddenly started. I do apologize. Ignore them. I've only found 5 situations of women being involved as investors or owners in slave voyages, but there are a number of women who received compensation under the Slavery Abolition Act. Caroline Cashard, née Devenish, received £3,277, 6 shillings and 4pence, as heir of her father or uncle. It's not entirely clear who James Devenish was, in respect of 60 people in Trinidad. And Hannah Tabernor, née Fox, the widow of Thomas Tabernor, received 3,300. It was mainly as beneficiaries under wills that the women received compensation, and it was not uncommon. There are quite a few. Members of the Earl family, 3 members of the Earl family, received in excess of £44,000 in compensation. The Earl family had been very, very heavily involved in the slave trade, and over 3 generations, really from the beginning of Liverpool's involvement in slave trade in 1700 to the end of it in 1807, a member of the Earl family had been involved. And it's difficult to work out because they were owners, several members of the family were owners of one slave voyage. So working out the numbers of people whose liberty they deprived is not easy. But anything from 40,000 to 100,000 people they took to the Americas, the Earl family, and received lavish compensation when they had to release the ones that they actually owned themselves as enslaved people on their plantations. The statue there on the right is General Earl, a direct descendant of, and he was killed in battle in the 1890s, I think, in the Sudan. And the picture on the bottom left is a picture of Allerton Towers, which was owned by the Earl family. There's a lodge there, and there's a bit of the orangery. The rest of it is fairly, well, it's gone, it's been demolished. It's now a public park, but you can see the outline of the park of where the house was. Churches benefited enormously from the compensation given to people. And Church of St. Anne in Egberth, a grade 2 star listed building, a very fine building, beautiful building. Built 1836 to 37, there's no accident there. This is when the money came through, sort of thing. Funded by 3 people. John Moss received £40,000 compensation. He was a banker, Moss, Dale and Rogers, and he'd also been heavily involved in the slave trade. Charles Stewart Parker received, with John Tinney and Henry Sandbach, received £87,000. The exact division of it isn't clear. But John Tinney, and in fact all 3 of those were partners in Sandbach Tinney, we'll see a little bit more about later. And Josiah Booker, who was a brother of Richard Booker, plantation owner, he's a West India merchant. He was chairman of the Royal Insurance and a director of the Royal Bank of Liverpool. As you look at the people who received compensation, you see that they start to play leading roles in organisations. We'll see a couple as we go on, but have a look, there's a lot more. So the Booker Brothers, the company was established in 1834. Again, no accident. When the enslaved people were given their freedom, 1834, the Booker Brothers established, became a PLC in 1986, and part of it split. Part of it is now owned by the big food company, who also own Iceland, the supermarket, and another branch of it is part of Tesco PLC now. So we've got Booker Avenue there in Liverpool, named after one or other members of the Booker family, Booker Wholesale, and the Booker Prize. Booker Prize is, I think it's a Booker, it's a Booker something prize now. It's not just the Booker Prize for literature, is also from the same stem, the same people. So a number of the sculptures in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool were donated by the Sandbach family of Sandbach Tinney, and part of the clothing collection at the Walker Art Gallery donated by the family of Emily Tinney, wife of Dr. Tinney, a direct descendant of the Sandbach Tinney business. Sandbach Tinney worked out of British Guyana, and George Parker was a partner, as well as the Sandbach and Tinney people and Stuart Parker. He received £91,000 in compensation. And Sandbach Tinney traded from 1782 to 1975. When I started in the bank in 75, I seem to have a recollection that I was involved in the finance of foreign trade, and I seem to have a recollection that we were finishing off the outstanding stuff for Sandbach Tinney. One of my first jobs was to do that in the Bills for Collection and Bills for Negotiation department. And I'm fairly sure that we were finishing off the work for Sandbach Tinney then. And there were also something else that the Sandbach Tinney were involved in that many people don't know about. They were involved in the supply of indentured labour Now, indentured labour, these were, they went to India. John Gladstone was also involved in this, who we're going to see a lot more about later. They went to India and they said, look, you can come to the West Indies, come to the Americas with us. We will not charge you, because we're awfully nice people. We will not charge you. We'll take you there and you work for us for 7 years without pay. And at the end of 7 years, you will be given a house and some land. So this had an attraction to certain people. If you were destitute, if you were, you know, eye-wateringly poor, if you had any one of a number of problems you might have that you wanted to get away from India, and there were plenty of people who took it up. And they went off to Demerara, Essequibo, the islands of the Caribbean, and worked for nothing. They were not enslaved people, technically, but to my mind, somebody who works for nothing and is obligated to work for nothing is an enslaved person, but they weren't classed as such, and classed as indentured labour. The Watt family, the Watt family coat of arms there, Watt of Speak. There were these people that when you're doing research, you always hate, because there were 3 Richard Watts, Richard Watt the first, second and third, and they were in the business at similar times. So it's trying to isolate who it is who was involved. Richard Watt the first was an owner of enslaved people, an early one, and he was also a slave trader. But Richard Watt III received compensation under the Act. Richard Watt I was the trustee of the Blue Coat Hospital. We spoke about that, I think, last week. A governor and trustee of the Liverpool Infirmary and Dispensary. And you will notice that there is a picture of Liverpool's Anglican Cathedral on there. And there's a small inset photograph in the middle of the screen there, which says, "In memory of Richard Watt, citizen of Liverpool, 1724 to 1796. The Watt family, when they were raising money to build Liverpool Cathedral, gave £1,200 specifically for the cost of the bishop's throne in Liverpool Cathedral." So here we have the bishop's throne with an inscription to Richard Watt, who was a slave trader and an owner of enslaved people. They're not by any means the only people who gave money, with the root of their money, if not the exact money that they gave, the root of the money, the root of their business, the root of their wealth came from slavery. That's part of my research that's ongoing. There were a lot. And Richard Watt I had, and Pastor Richard Watt II and III, he owned Speke Hall, the picture in the bottom picture there, which obviously is still there, owned by the National Trust. And he owned Bishop Burton Hall in Beverley in Yorkshire, which is now not there. There's still something called Bishop Burton Hall, but I think it's a school or an education establishment or something. So here's Richard Watt III, received £4,485 in compensation. These were major Liverpool people. Charles Turner, 1803 to 1875, there's a statue there of Charles Turner and his son. Charles on the right, they died within 5 years of each other, and Charles Turner's widow built the Turner home at the end of Park Road in Liverpool. It's still there. It's now a care home for older people, but it was originally specifically started for destitute men. There were plenty of destitute men around Liverpool. Once you got too old to go to sea, you became destitute and you were too old to do anything, and you ended up destitute, and the Charles Turner home would take you in and give you a bed and food. So Charles Turner received £2,500 in compensation. He was MP for Liverpool. He was the MP later for South Lancashire, chairman of the Royal Insurance, I think he's the second chairman of the Royal Insurance we've had, and chairman of the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board. Again, we're seeing the wealth and the kudos of being wealthy people translating into positions of importance in Liverpool. I'm just noticing that there are 6 chats here. Would you mind if I just have a quick look at them to see if we've got any that I can reply to? Somebody's clarifying here, it was the Booker Prize for fiction, then the Man Booker Prize, and now again just the Booker Prize. Thank you for that. Daniel has told me that. Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. So woman owned slaves, married at this time. Did the husband automatically take over the ownership? It was before the Married Women's Property Act, so it's extremely unlikely that the woman would have owned slaves in her own name. John Bolton's big memorial stone in the churchyard, the centre of Bowness on Windermere. Thank you, Jane. And did certain events' behaviour determine the severity of the punishment? No, some of the punishment of enslaved people was gratuitous. It was, you know, you didn't look up, you didn't look at the overseer in the eyes, you just carried on with your job. You paused to stretch your back or to relax your arms or whatever, and you would get beaten for your trouble there. A long message here from Christine. History Whisper Exposition St George's Hall was talking about that. The guides didn't mention slavery. St George's Hall will feature in the talk next week. So, you know, we will still be talking about that next week. Okay, so let's get on. I've got the wrong thing. Joseph Ashton Yates, 1780, 1855. Yates family heavily involved in the slave trade, and he received £44,000 in compensation. A number of estates in Jamaica. A number of people owned several estates, and sometimes they owned them as mortgagees. They were people of considerable wealth, and they lent money to people to buy the estate or to expand it. And when the compensation was paid, it was paid to the mortgagee, not necessarily the owner. So Yates was one of these. He had these. One of the founders of the Liverpool Royal Institution, which is perhaps important because the Liverpool Royal Institution is what the University of Liverpool claim as its start point. Obviously, it wasn't the University of Liverpool, but they will go back to the Royal Institution, the Liverpool Royal Institution, as their precursor. So it is important. Yates was one of the founders of this. That again is research that's ongoing. Partner in Franz Fletcher & Co., West India merchants. And he was a Unitarian. It's quite unusual to have Unitarians involved in slavery in any form. There was some, and Yates is one of them. And it was really ironic because he was a prominent figure in local campaigns in favour of civil liberties. His passion for civil liberties did not extend to the people that he owned, that his employees treated abysmally in the Caribbean. He didn't see any issue there in campaigning for civil liberties in Britain and denying them in the Americas. So here's John Gladstone. John Gladstone was the biggest recipient from Liverpool of compensation. I say 105,000. Far more to the point, he was the biggest recipient of any compensation that was paid under the 1833 Act. And here's his house, number 62 Rodney Street, still there. With a plaque on it, you can see the plaque to the left of the front door, a grey plaque, not a blue plaque, grey plaque, commemorating the birth of William Ewart Gladstone, who was one of his sons, who we're going to see a little bit more about. And spend a little bit more time about Gladstone because it was such enormous payment that he received, and he was very active in a lot of areas. So he first came to Liverpool from Scotland, 1786, and by 1799, it's only 13 years, had a personal wealth of £40,000, not inconsiderable then. 1801, he formed his own business trading with Calcutta. 1803, began trading in sugar and cotton in the West Indies and started to buy estates, started to buy plantations there. By 1809, He was chairman of the extremely influential Liverpool West Indian Association, an extremely powerful body of merchants in Liverpool. When the council was looking for money to build a memorial to Nelson, Nelson had been a great saviour of the West Indies. The West India Association gave £500 towards the memorial. We're going from 1799 to 1828, 29 years. His personal wealth of 40,000. His personal wealth 29 years later was £500,000. And this is down to cotton and sugar, especially sugar. He invested a total of 111,000 in 5 railway companies. We're going to talk about railway companies a bit later. I won't talk about it now. Director of the Royal Bank of Scotland. I do know you can read incidentally, just read this. Gave £35,000 towards the foundation of the Liverpool Collegiate Institution, a very well-known and highly respected institution in Liverpool. Built St Andrew's Episcopal Church in Renshaw Street, funded that entirely, 1815. St Thomas's Church in Seaforth, he also paid for. Seaforth House. Seaforth is where the docks are now, the most northern of the North Docks in Liverpool, but it was a country retreat then, and he built Seaforth House to live there. And he was instrumental in raising the money for the Convoy Suspension Bridge. He knew a lot of people, he was influential and he was trusted, and he raised the money for that. He was the MP for Lancaster, MP for Woodstock in Oxfordshire, MP for Berwick, Northumberland, and in 1846 created first Baron of Fask and Balfour by Sir Robert Peel. And he had 3 sons who were MPs. So Thomas Gladstone, and they're the various constituency he was, John Nielsen Gladstone. Could we remember this was a time when MPs weren't paid? So Daddy was having his hands in his pocket for 3 MPs to live in London and to carry on the business. But most famous, obviously, of the Gladstone brothers was William Ewart Gladstone, born in that house in Rodney Street, MP for Newark, and a Liberal Conservative. He was MP for Oxford University, which was elected by the people from Oxford University who had MAs. They elected the MP for Oxford University. And I'm struggling to find the other constituencies he was MP for, if he was other than Oxford University. Perhaps somebody can help me out and email me. When I was looking at it, it goes in, once he becomes a minister, it talks about the influences on his life and things like this. And doesn't seem to have any interest in where he was MP for. And I tried and tried. If somebody could find out where he was, I'd be enormously grateful for that. 4 times Chancellor of the Exchequer and 4 times Prime Minister. There hasn't been in the history of British Parliament anybody else who has been Prime Minister for 4 times. Gladstone was, and there is Gladstone's memorial in St John's Garden behind St George's Hall in Liverpool. And there was last year a stick-on interpretation piece put on talking about the Gladstone family involved in slavery, and it was removed. It was ripped off. It was just stuck on and ripped off. It was put on again and it was ripped off again. What's going to happen regarding the interpretation boards that the City Council are going to put on, I'm not sure. We'll have to wait and see how that pans out. So we've already said John Gladstone, significant investor in railways. Their compensation that these people received came along at a very handy time for the railway boom of the early 1830s. And these are the directors of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway who received compensation, I do beg your pardon, I keep saying it, compensation for freeing their enslaved people. Charles Lawrence, he was chairman of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, 3,499. John Moss, we've seen before, built St Anne's Church in Aigburth, received 40,000, deputy chairman. Robert Gladstone the Younger, as executor of Robert Gladstone, John Gladstone's brother, received 9,200. Mr. Ellis, 7,700, and John Ewart, 2,790. It was in the interests of these people to build the railway between Liverpool and Manchester, because cotton, increasing amounts of cotton, ever increasing vast amounts of cotton were coming in. They needed to be taken to Manchester, to the cotton towns of Lancashire, and finished goods brought back for export. Railways, as long as they actually worked, it was a perilous business building a railway. You could lose your shirt on a railway if you weren't careful, because it was all expenditure until they opened. But for example, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, its takings in the first year of operation were as much as it had cost to build it. That doesn't mean that you repaid all your debt. It just means that, give you an idea of how much, around about £100,000 to do it. And other railway investors in other railways, other railway companies, Rains Appleton, Thomas Boosh. Appleton had been involved in the slave trade, so had Boosh. Peter Whitfield Branca, his family has an involvement in the slave trade, in plantation ownership, and in importation of goods cultivated by enslaved people. Robert Brown there, £173,000. He was a beneficiary of compensation. Charles Lawrence again, total of £99,000, Luke Crossley, and John Moss again, £222,000. If you work on the basis premise of investment, in that you only invest money that you're prepared to lose, which is the general principle of it, then Moss was an incredibly wealthy man, slave trader, owner of enslaved people. So here's a quotation from a book by Baines, The History of the Commerce and Trade of Liverpool, 1859. The commerce created by the importation of raw cotton and the exportation of cotton manufactures is the greatest branch of commerce which now exists, or which has ever existed in the British Empire. 5/6 of this prodigious trade is carried on through the port of Liverpool. Baines includes information within his book about amounts, and I could bore you all for the rest of the day on this, but as an example, in 1858, 1,500 million yards of cotton cloth were exported from Liverpool. So that's, the raw cotton came in, made into cotton cloth. This isn't what to be made into clothes or printed or anything. This is raw, what they call grey cloth, basic cotton cloth. An enormous business, all facilitated by ownership of enslaved people. So the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, 1834, the Act of 1833, was not the end of it. America didn't abolish slavery until 1865, Cuba, 1886, and Brazil, 1888. And Liverpool merchants, the West India merchants, carried on, and they're importing goods cultivated by enslaved people, which gave them an edge financially to do that, to achieve that. It went on. It's another 50 years after slavery was abolished. Okay, so the information for who was recipients of compensation can be said that the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, University College London, you'll get an introduction page which tells you about the Act, to tell you about all that's going on, but you will also get this page. This is search, and you can see you can search by name, surname, you can towns, you can search by claims if you know the claim number and things like this. You can search by all this. I'm afraid the dogs are going to bark again. The postman has just arrived. I apologise. You can do this. Whereas the slave trade database that I mentioned last week was quite a clunky search engine because it's got such a massive amount of information on it. This is more refined and more limited, and you'll find it is an excellent search engine if you're interested in finding out more. So two books I can recommend. I wanted to do this last week, and I didn't really have time, unfortunately. Two books I want to recommend to you. One specifically, a new book last year by Michael Taylor called The Interest, about how the British establishment resisted the abolition of slavery. Excellent book, a lot in it about Liverpool, obviously, and that's well worth a read. And the one I mentioned at the beginning of the talk was this one by Dr. Eric Williams, not published in Britain before. My copy came from America. First published in 1944. Edition I've got, I think it was 1994, and there's a new introduction in it. But Eric Williams talks about all aspects of the slave trade and slave ownership, cultivation of goods by enslaved people. And it's from the point of view of somebody from the West Indies, a direct descendant of an enslaved person. And it's fascinating because he talks about the money coming in, fueling the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and how that was built on literally on the backs of enslaved people. Well worth a read. And another book about general slave trade, which I meant to talk to you about last week, The History of Liverpool Privateers and Letters of Marque, in itself an interesting subject, but with an account of the Liverpool slave trade. The back quarter of the book, I would say, is about the slave trade. Highly detailed. The book was written in 1898, and highly detailed, an excellent book on the subject. There's my email address. I've got a couple of chats out. Just before we go, I'm just being naughty. I have asked Danny if I can do this. I've written 2 books about slavery in Liverpool. I'm 90% of the way through the third. The first one was The Slave Streets of Liverpool. Streets, about 100 streets in Liverpool and 5 on the Wirral that have connections with slavery. And 27th of June 1793, one day of the Liverpool slave trade. And that is a newspaper from that date, has a lot of entries, a lot of adverts, a lot of detail in it connected with the slave trade. And I've extracted that and explained that, and you get a book and you get a facsimile copy of the newspaper as well. And you can get that from the company my son and I run, www.devilsnest.co.uk. I feel in what I've done last week and this week, you know, I've spoken for an hour. It will have seemed a lot longer to you, I'm sure, but I'm scratching the surface. You know, it's an enormous subject. And Danny and I were speaking before, we just to test the technology before thing. And what I said, what I would like to come from this is more of a discussion, more of a realization that Liverpool was heavily involved in slavery in all sorts of ways. And there's a sense of denial in some places. Some people will seek to minimize the involvement. There are people who deny it. And what I'd love if came from this is that people have a bit more knowledge. Perhaps people can look a bit more for themselves at things. That's why I was anxious to give you the links. And generally talk to people about it and generally accept that, you know, it happened. Next week, I'll be talking about Liverpool's involvement in the American Civil War. And that works on about 3 or 4 different levels, all quite interesting. And if you can join me, that would be lovely. And Daniel is asking me a question. This month is LGBTQI+ History Month. Any accounts from LGBTIQ+ slaves and how they were treated? I have to say, Daniel, I haven't come across any comments on this at all. I think perhaps the important thing to remember is, of course, it was homosexual acts were illegal until 1968 in the UK, and they would have been illegal in British colonies. And because of that, people were unlikely to write about their experiences. I've not seen any in the literature that I've seen, but it's not particularly my area of research. I'm more of an economic historian, so I didn't go into that aspect of it. I would be fascinated to hear if you're able to come up with some sources for that. A very interesting aspect to it. You know, the people who were enslaved people were first and foremost people. So I cannot imagine that there was any less of a percentage of LGBTQI plus people then than there were now. So it's a part of history. Please Daniel, email me if you have any sources for that. I would be very, very interested. And thanks to everybody. I've got lots of thank yous clicking up on the chat. Thank you very much indeed. I don't think you can say you enjoyed it, but I hope you found it interesting. Thank you very much indeed.